All right, so Jeremy, don't use the mic like you're Blackbeard. Oh, there's a delay in the thing.
Yeah.
That's weird. I hope.
Yeah, I tested the mic and everything. It's coming through. It is loud.
Oh, it's going around the world.
So now I'm really fast to get as much music done before we all start.
The whole world wants to see.
Or really tiny bites.
Very good. Yeah.
Well, if y'all in here, you're gonna have to let me know when y'all want to watch me again. We need to do that again.
You know, that's what we're doing. The Italian was better.
What restaurant was that?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So in today's community conversation, entitled Liberationist Black Church Identities, Reverend Dr. Williams and I, we just want to have a conversation with each other, with you all, about what Liberationist Black Church looks like, feels like, sounds like. And we're going to take the route of a millennial take to get this conversation going. Reverend Jeremy L. Williams, let me do a quick intro. Reverend Jeremy L. Williams, PhD, is a native of Huntsville, Alabama. He successfully defended his PhD dissertation on racialization and criminalization in Acts of the Apostles at Harvard University. Dr. Williams is assistant professor of New Testament here at Brite, and he graduated with highest honors in religious studies and economics from Vanderbilt University. He also earned an MDiv degree from Yale Divinity School. Reverend Williams is an ordained elder in full connection in the Christian Episcopal Church. He served in ministry for almost 20 years. Doesn't he look good to be that old? and as lead pastor of 2 congregations in Connecticut, including Phillips Metropolitan CME Church in Hartford. He is also a national awardee of his honorable fraternity Kappa Alpha Psi. So, Reverend Dr. Williams. And I am Dr. Oluwatomisin Oredein. I teach in the areas of Black religious traditions and constructive theology and ethics here at Brite. And I consider my lens and worldview as one of an American African. I'm a 1.5 generation Nigerian, born in Nigeria, but raised in the US. So this means I have a multi-layered experience with, and I joyfully try to complicate what Black identity is and what Blackness means. So we are bringing all of this experience, all this knowledge, all of our questions and curiosities into the conversation today, again, on Liberationist Black Church Identities. I have a whole bunch of questions, but we're going to see just kind of where this goes. We'll start off with some questions. I want to hear questions from you all. We'll have a conversation. We're going to be passing the mic back and forth, but we want a good conversation about what the possibility is for Liberationist Black Church Identities, plural. I'm going to start with the opening question, and I'm going to see where this momentum takes us. What is your experience with Black church?
Talk about open-ended questions. Yes. Oh, first, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you all for coming out to this community conversation. So my experience with Black church, as she already noted in our different identities, a very layered question, because there's been a number of experiences that I've had in the Black churches. And one reason I note that, and we've talked about this before, that I'm really intentional when we think about what is often called the Black church, to think about it more as Black churches, because Black church experience is in no way monolithic, but even more so, into the audience out there, what's interesting to note are that in some ways there are some difficult experiences that Black churches continue to perpetuate, some very violent forms of hierarchical white supremacy. But I believe the Black church in its best version does demonstrate opportunities to extend liberation and abolition for Black people and minoritized people. And so in part of what I would say in some of the best parts of those experiences were some of the ways that I was able to work with a congregation in Hartford at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when the pandemic hit. Congregations were having to wrestle with the difficulty of when you cannot meet in person, especially in many African American church traditions, where worshiping in person with the charismatic experiences and the movement of the spirit and the music, those things don't translate well on Zoom and on Facebook Live. So thinking through and being creative with how do you continue to create this worship experience, even in the middle of this pandemic when we have to be virtual, was one of those moments where we were able to think about how do you keep people together. But even more importantly than just the worship experience, one thing that we committed ourselves to as a congregation was to think through how do we meet some of the material needs of the members of the congregation and the community in a moment when people don't have access to resources, people weren't able to go to work. You remember the lockdown and the shutdown. And so being a part of this community at this moment was a really powerful opportunity to see how we could demonstrate God's love and bring the reign of God into the world, in one of the most underserved areas in Hartford at the time, to actually get people food. We were serving food. We were the first testing site for COVID. That was way back before there were any vaccines. And so we were able to take resources and take this network of people and to bring some real resources to this community of Black and brown people where the church was located. And beyond that, what was great about this moment for us was that we were able to recognize that the real work of church, and especially the Black church, was never centered, especially this best version that I'm talking about, was never centralized in what happened on Sunday morning. But it was the work that was happening in between Sundays that helped to transform the lives of people and the political and material situations of the folks in the community where that building was located. Because the building was the place where the church met to do the work. And so that's my start to the answer. So we'll see where it goes from here.
I'm gonna lean into my Auntie Oprah role here and just keep these questions coming. You mentioned, you used the words liberationist, you used the word abolitionist. Liberation.
First, that's a great question. And here's where I'll pull out my New Testament scholar hat with and in line with Professor Gaffney's sermon last week at the Episcopal service in Luke 4, when Jesus preaches his, what I would call an initial sermon if I was in the Black church tradition. He recites or reads from the scroll in Isaiah 61 where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, to liberate those who are oppressed, and to declare the year of the Lord's favor." And I use the Lord here particularly to highlight that appeal that the Jesus of Luke understands Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible to be this heroic liberation figure who didn't only liberate the people of Israel from Egyptian bondage, but from Babylonian tyranny, and continues to liberate those who are in prison, which the second part of Luke Acts we see through all of the prison breaks and deliverances. And so, for me, liberation has to be read through that lens. And that's the lens through which I see the gospel, through which I see the work of Jesus as doing the work of casting out demonic systemic oppression, but also bringing the compassion of God to people who society has left marginalized and left in prisons, to demonstrate to them that the year of God's release is relevant, is available to all people. And it is something that is not just in some impending eschatological moment, but that this liberation is available now. For the moment that Jesus came to announce was not just some impending kingdom, but was that this moment where slaves, which is what the year of Jubilee was concerning, that slaves who were in bondage were to be liberated. It was a moment to happen now. And so the work that Jesus as Savior, as healer, as rescuer from oppression is fundamental to how I understand what the work of liberation is, and what people who claim to follow Jesus should be about. For every system of oppression that continues to put people on crosses, that continues to put people in prisons with unjust sentences and with over-policing and over-surveillance, in every system that continues to take food out of people's mouths, they don't have what's necessary for them to live. It's liberation looks like destroying patriarchal militancy, racialization, intensity, economic inequity, environmental insensitivity, educational inequality, criminalization, intentionality, and healthcare inaccessibility. That's the work of liberation for me.
You hear that pastor language coming through in what he offers here. I want to pause because I don't want it to be, us talking for 30 minutes and you all not contributing to the conversation. I want to see who else has thoughts or questions to further enrich anything that Dr. Williams has offered thus far. Again, I want y'all to be a part of it as well. All right. What does liberation feel like?
Let me ask you some questions.
Oh, no.
What does liberation feel like?
What does liberation feel like?
Yeah.
My answers are not as pastoral as Reverend Williams, but I don't think they're any less true. Liberation feels like, I'll speak in I terms, I am existing in a hard, difficult, or tough place, and I feel seen and I feel helped. That to me is what liberation feels like. I feel seen and I feel helped. Next question. If you ask questions, or
No, go for it.
We can pivot a little bit.
Okay.
And focus back on Black church. What would you say are the hopes of the origins of Black church? The hopes of its origins.
One thing that this question immediately leads me to consider are the ways that enslaved people in the United States met in hush harbors in order to practice their worship of the God of Jesus, as well as ancestral traditions outside of the gaze of their enslavers. And I think that moment as origins for Black church is both instructive about where the Black church in America has started, but it also, to me, is instructive about a way for us to examine the earliest documents of the early Jesus following Messiah movement. Because sometimes we, from our contemporary lens, read the ancient stories in the New Testament through this post-Constantinian, post-imperial, colonial expansion world. But what I often think about with the origins of the ways that enslaved Africans were able to hear the message of Jesus and to have navigated in the face of empire, particularly American slaveocracy, it aligns much more with the environment of the first Jesus followers, who were themselves on the margins, particularly enslaved people, or as Abdul and Muhammad would call, death-bound subjects, because crucifixion itself was not the type of execution that a high-status person would receive, but it was reserved for enslaved people and criminal people and insurrectionists. And so the people who that message would appeal to were people who were crucifiable, people whose lives were on the margins and on the borders of very humanity, bare life, as Giorgio Agamben might call it. And those people who heard that message and were inspired by the idea that empire, even when it tries its damnedest, cannot kill what God wants alive, was the movement that would take root amongst these marginalized folks. And so then I think that community of enslaved people who were hearing this message and trying to make sense of it under this vicious oppression might actually be a better starting place for thinking about Christian origins itself than libraries and theological academic discourse. And although that work has its role, but I think that this particular understanding of experience of oppression and marginalization actually brings us into closer proximity to those first communities and allows us to more accurately reconstruct. So then, to show kind of why academically, then we don't do the work of projecting our contemporary imperial ideology onto what was at stake for these early Jesus followers, and we actually can see why the message would have been appealing in the first place. And so now, since I got the mic to ask a question, I want to see how you think that legacy of the origins of Black church continues to play out in the way that various African American congregations think about theological liberation, but also in the ways that those origins are part of their identities still, or have some of these communities lost that identity? Okay. So the question is thinking with these origins of Black churches, has that moment or that understanding of origins, has that continued in various Black theologies? And I guess I have a supplemental question to whichever direction that you go. So I'll stop it there, and then I'll just, and then you go where you go. And then the students who I've had, they know I ask big questions, a paragraph long question. So I'll stop there.
Black theology is a Black ecclesiology.
You too.
One thing you said is really interesting. I'm like, it's kind of weird because I'm like, I want to respond to you, but I also want to, oh, I lost it.
Black church origins.
Black church origins.
Does it still play it out?
I'll just start talking. You said something about making sure they escaped the gaze of like white slave owners and masters, etc. And I'm wondering, like, is it fair to think Black church as a means of worship that just escapes the gaze of whiteness in whatever ways that it can. I mean, I would say yes and no to that. Many of us know Black church in general, but definitely Black church historically is a place of refuge. It's a place of sanctuary. It's a place to fully be oneself in front of community, in front of the God that they worship, in ways that are free, in ways that are not bound, in ways that are not performative for whiteness. Does it continue today? You said in Black theologies?
Or Black churches. I saw ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Part of it.
So yes, there's a continuation of this idea of Black church as sanctuary, Black church as refuge. It's one of those places where on Sunday you don't have to perform for whiteness at work or in society. So you go to Black church, you go to a place where you are the majority for once, and you are able to fully be yourself. So yes, there's a continuation of that historical legacy that continues on even today. In terms of Black church being a space of community, yes and no. Providing for community, taking care of material needs, offering political messages. Some of those things do exist and continue to exist in Black churches. But if we're honest and if we're frank, a lot of Black churches kind of get caught in the rut of getting comfortable with escaping the white gaze. So they just want to continue to just kind of be their own space for their own people, which is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But paying attention to the material conditions of Black life, trying to better Black social life as a whole, that message can kind of get lost in maintaining the practice of refuge. Refuge no longer is as expansive as taking care of needs, as attending to people's psychologies. It becomes a space of habit and practicing repetition. And though repetition and habit, especially repetition and habit that are expressive and that feel liberative are important, liberation stays contained. It doesn't expand outward, it doesn't transform if it's just, again, just the practice and the habit of participating in Black church aesthetic life.
Now that makes me think particularly about some of the ways that freedom discourse gets used within various Black church spaces. And I think a lot about how in a lot of contemporary Christian music, right, there are a lot of these appeals to and liberation, freedom, freedom to worship, freedom to do all of these things. But that freedom often is not connected to any type of political or social concerns, but it's a freedom that gets contained. Would that be some of that kind of like self-contained freedom within Black churches and in those spaces, or what do you think about that?
So the way that I think about it and even teach is that Black church, when we think about the origins of the Black church, we think of hush harbors, we think of, again, worship away from the oppressive forces of whiteness. That's freedom. We get to freely be who we are, we get to freely express ourselves, we get to freely commune with God in this way. Liberation, that goes beyond freedom. Liberation says, okay, well, it says freedom and. So yes, we're outside of the white gaze, and now we get to undo where whiteness has entangled us outside of this worship space. We get to undo where whiteness has entangled us in the world and in society as well. So freedom is a great start. It's in many ways, in the way I teach it, part of the origins of the Black church. But liberation says, okay, who else is not free? Even within our own respective spaces and circles. Who else is not free? Who else needs to experience the same thing that we've experienced? How can we make sure that everybody is engaged with this idea of feeling human in this space, feeling fully human in this space and outside of this space as well? So liberation is freedom on steroids, I would say. But it's I mean, Black churches that get caught up in freedom, that's fantastic, that's great, that's freedom of expression and worship. But liberation says, we're gonna go beyond just this practice, and we're gonna figure out how to be more to each other and to those around us as well. What about you? Liberation versus freedom.
That's really rich. I haven't really thought about dichotomizing the words in that way. But what I have considered, especially as we look at biblical texts and we look at a really prominent name that's used to describe God in both testaments or both covenants is Lord or Kyrios, which is a slave owner. It's an owner of humans, of people, right? And that's a dominant motif that often has an underlying heartbeat of both testaments and of theological discourse. And so if owning other humans is a part of understandings of the divine, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we consider divinity. And in line with that, that also causes us to reimagine what freedom really looks like. Because if what we have as a basis is a conception of being freed from one system to be enslaved to another, then we have not actually moved into freedom. We just moved into a different type of bondage. So the question that we have to always raise for me is, why is freedom even necessary?
Right.
Because the presence of freedom, or the ability to name something freedom, insists that there is bondage or slavery somewhere.
Right.
And so I was traveling in Turkey for an archaeology trip, and I was talking to one of my colleagues one time, and I was wrestling with this question, well, freedom and enslavement. And I said, if there was not bondage and there was not slavery, would we have freedom? And so, pondering and waiting for a while, my colleague, Sarah Porter is her name, she said, yes, we would have freedom, but we wouldn't need a word for it. And I believe that might be what I would say is the difference between freedom and liberation. The ability to be without it needing to be named.
Take a quick pause, see if there are any thoughts or questions.
I just wanted to touch on your point about Black churches being a refuge on Sunday. And oftentimes in liberal mainline white spaces, we talk about the need to diversify the church and often quote the, church is the most segregated place on Sunday mornings. This has been a constant thought of mine, though, when I hear voices like y'all's, is how do we balance this need to get together to better understand one another, but preserve spaces of safety? Can you kind of speak on that, on balancing the need to kind of come together, but also maintain that space?
Thank you for your question, Matt. Dr. Williams will go first.
Okay, thank you, Matt, for that question. And I think I'll turn the question a bit and then see if you have another response. But one thing that is pretty common, especially in multicultural church movements, are that churches with white leadership want Black bodies to become a part of those churches with white leadership. But one of the challenges that I would want to pose in considering how we would diversify, is how many white Christians would be willing to serve under Black leadership to help to create this multi-ethnic movement. And part of that, part of that idea, I gained some basis from Acts, and I talk about Acts all, that's where my research is in the way that the earliest Jesus followers, led by Peter, a cussing fisherman, uneducated, and the court said, how is this uneducated Galilean leading anybody? But these were the people whom Jesus put in charge of the movement after he left. So what if we thought about using Acts and thought about our churches and our spaces for where we meet to commemorate the life of this person executed unjustly by the state, by actually discharging from myself the mantle of having to always be in charge and to be the one that has the voice, but to listen and to actually support somebody else's vision, especially a vision from the margins. That vision from the margins very frequently, especially as we can see in many Black church traditions, including the one most recognizable to Americans, voiced by Dr. Martin Luther King, is generally a vision that is positive for everybody, right? It's generally it's not often that I would say, and you might disagree with this, that Black churches have become separatists because they have animosity toward their white siblings. It's generally the other way around. And so what would it take to get white Christians to say, I'll support and be a part of a Black-led congregation and see what their vision for bringing the reign of God into the world is? Because often in America, integration is seen as a one-way street, where minoritized people have to move into white spaces to integrate them. But if it's true integration, there's something to learn from those Black Jesus followers who have these connections to being marginalized and to saying that we get what it's like to say that he was numbered amongst the transgressors and there was no deceit in his mouth.
Oh, it's so scriptural. It's wonderful. I know. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. And I'm just theological. I'm gonna just say ideas and things. And Matt, thank you for your question. I think your response was very generous, Dr. Williams. I don't even think we would start there. Diversity initiatives, let's call it what it is, racial reconciliation initiatives, serve white churches. They don't serve minoritized churches. Minoritized persons and churches are requested to do the labor of tolerating spaces that have been oppressive to them, that they created their own institutions to not be oppressed by, and then to turn around and then be asked to enter into this space and integrate it for the white morality, attending to white morality. What the question that I'd be most interested around this diversity, racial reconciliation question is, why do white churches feel that they need it in the first place? What have they done to undo themselves, to release themselves from racist traditions and ideas that have upheld and become pillars of their traditions for so long? What are they willing to let crumble so they can ask the right question in the first place, which is, why does this white church need whiteness in order to maintain and keep itself? Why does this white church that needs whiteness now need blackness in order to feel better about itself? What needs to be morally addressed that we assume bringing in Black and brown and Asian bodies is going to address in order for us to feel like we're truly living into our spirituality correctly? The question of living into one's spirituality correctly, I think, needs to be asked within white spaces first. Ask, what's the origin of the white church? That needs to be asked. What is keeping it white? Because answering that question addresses what keeps Black churches Black and what keeps Latinx churches Latinx, and et cetera, et cetera. So until white churches can ask questions about their own origins, their own makeup, their own traditions, I think it's frankly violent to ask minoritized persons to come in and do work for one's own feeling or sense of spiritual morality. But thank you for your question. It's an ongoing concern, but I think the question should start within the white ecclesial spaces, and I think some honest untangling, naming that Black history is entangled with white history, that Black church history is entangled with white church history needs to happen first within white churches, especially within denominational origins. Okay, can we keep it moving, or does anybody have a question or thought they want to add to that? Okay, Dr. Williams, is there such a thing as a liberationist Black church? And if so, what are its hopes?
You had so many questions. This was one I was hoping that we may not get to because it's I think that the reason why this question gives me a bit of trepidation is because I feel like in many ways we have misunderstood what church is supposed to be about and what church or the movement of God's people is. And frequently, when we think about what type of church something is, we bring a number of assumptions. It's a place where people gather once a week, or where people listen to this. They have this social justice program. They do feeding, kind of like how I answered my question at first about the types of work that we as an institution do. But when I think about the church, we call it the big C church, the ecclesia, the called out assembly, the movement of God's people. It has no way but to be liberationist. It essentially is about, especially Black's narrative, it's about proclaiming the narrative that unjust courts crucified and executed through state-sponsored means the just person, Son of God, and executed that person. But then through the resurrection, God overturned the court's decision by raising Jesus from the dead. That's the essence of what the movement is about. When the movement becomes about anything else, it easily can become co-opted to serve interests of preserving institutions' lives. And then we really become, for lack of a better word, appropriators of the story of a minoritized, brown-skinned, Palestinian-born Jewish person executed by the state, and we use that person's story for our own organization and institutional maintenance. And then have the audacity to say, his body broken for you. And so then our institutions consume black flesh for their sustenance. And that's counterintuitive to liberation. That's counterintuitive to the movement that Jesus started. And so for me, if we think about the Black church as a part of this liberation movement, it has to be the liberation church. But when we start to use the message and work of Jesus for our own interests and for the preservation of ourselves and our institutions, then to me, we are walking on very, very dangerous ground. What do you think?
I do not expect to answer this question, much like you, the such thing as a liberationist Black church. You clarified that you think of Black church in terms of Black churches. Notice that in these questions, I don't say the Black church. I say Black church. I think about them separately. The Black church is the institution, the gathering in particular buildings and the respective ministries and movements that come out of that. Church, to me, is so much more expansive than that particular body. I think it starts there and it blossoms and blooms into something more, into something else. Black church, it's everywhere. It's in rock music. It's in R&B. It's in politicians and their values and morals. It's in Black Lives Matter. It's a seed that's planted from the Black church in people. There they say, liberationist flower that I'm going to take and plant in other places, in different spaces. And I might not be affiliated with the Black church in particular, but I'm going to take this liberationist root and I'm going to, it's part of me, it's part of my flesh, it's part of my body, it's part of how I think, and it's going to extend into everything that I touch. That to me is how Black church can be liberationist. Again, its origins are in freedom, but when it moves elsewhere and it moves outside of the institution alone, that's when it takes root, and that's when it has, it lives into the fullest extent of what it can mean to be liberationist. That's how I see Black church acknowledging its history, but also expanding what its future could be as well.
Dr. Owen and Dr. Williams, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm Monica Bradley, Brite alum, Director of Admission. And Dr. Owen, you kind of answered my question a little bit. Do you have to attend church, the Black church, to be Black church? No, straight up no. I would love to hear what Dr. Williams expound on that a little bit.
Oh, that's a good question. I agree. I think the best any kind of church happens outside of what happens on Sunday mornings. The Black church, white church, Latinx church, because the church is doing the work of bringing the reign of God into the world. So yeah, you can, like, if I do my New Testament thing again, that Jesus was not a Christian and didn't go to church on Sundays, and Jesus' work was amongst the oppressed, amongst the sick, amongst those who needed to experience the liberating power of God's mercy, love, compassion, and justice. And so that's where the work is. That's where if you want to find a church, unfortunately, you're not often going to find them in buildings with padded pews and stained glass windows and crystal chandeliers. If you want to find the church, find them where the oppressed are, where the marginalized are, and where people who have been left out, excluded, and beat down. And those people, where they are being catered to, where they are being at the center of the conversation, that's where the church is.
And I'm serious about the music thing. I mean, like Whitney Houston, like people with these church backgrounds whose music like frees people and liberates people. Aretha Franklin, I mean, it's when people assert Black church values into the world and it like sparks and creates a fire in different parts of the world, like that's Black church. That's the liberationist agenda and movement of the Black church. And it doesn't have to be, labeled by, and I go to this church and this is my pastor, and it doesn't need to sound like that. It's freer than even the categories and labels that we even want to give it or even try to speak about it or talk about it. Black church is everywhere. Black church influences, let's be real, so much of American culture. I mean, dig deep. The musicians, the political figures, social figures, there's Black church origins there. Black church is in LGBTQIA+ movements. It's everywhere. It touches everything. It influences everything, for good or for bad. But it creates and influences points and spaces of liberation. And it might not be particularly tied to a congregation. And that's the magic of it. Irma, I think you have a question, and then let me do a time check. So, one or two more questions.
So my question was, if that is the case, that Black churches everywhere and just basically everything y'all said, then what is the role and importance of the Big C Black Church? If it is the origin space, those padded pews and stained glass windows, because as a millennial preacher, a lot of the talk from the elders are, there are no young people coming back to this space, and that it is losing populations and it's dying, that the Black church, Big C Black church is dying. And so the question I have is, what is the function of that space if this now is becoming this unsituated, kind of unstagnant Black church?
Yeah, that whole sentiment of Black church, the Black church is dying, I mean, maybe, but it doesn't mean Black church is dying. Well, again, we got to make that distinction. Maybe these Big C Black church spaces are memorial spaces, spaces to recognize and honor the history of Black church, and those who need it to be expressed in such way can have a place to go and, again, have contact with history, contact with ancestors, contact with that memory. But it doesn't mean that Black church is not alive outside of those spaces. It's alive inside and outside of those spaces. That's my long and short answer to it.
And similarly, I'm reminded of something that my Mima says, and she says that the church won't die while Jesus lives, and that's more than just a folksy aphorism, but for me, sometimes those conversations about Black churches dying or denominations are dying, we have to remember two things. The first, that if it's a Christian church, then we believe that God can raise the dead. But the second is, if this is truly the work of Jesus who is yet alive, according to Christian proclamation, then if you're in a dead space, then you might be in the sepulcher after the resurrections happen. And Jesus may be alive somewhere else. As Professor Oredein mentioned, Jesus was moving through the streets during the Black Lives Matter movement. Jesus was active when not only civil rights movement, but active in LGBTQIA plus movements. Jesus is active and moving, and so these denominations need to find where Jesus is. Perhaps for too long, they've been looking for the living amongst the dead.
And we'll end right there. Please give a hand of applause to Reverend Dr. Jamie Williams. Thank you all for coming and engaging with us in this conversation. Please, I think, Ingrid, I assume people can take food or, okay. All right, wonderful. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good one. Thank you for those who joined my stream.